You're not in love, you're trauma bonded, and that's why. What if the reason you can't leave is not love? What if your heart became addicted to emotional survival? What if the relationship feels impossible to escape because your nervous system was conditioned to need the pain and the relief at the same time? Because that is what trauma bonds do. They make emotionally painful relationships feel emotionally necessary. And maybe part of you already knows the relationship is hurting you. Maybe you already know your peace disappeared a long time ago. Maybe you are emotionally exhausted, mentally drained, constantly anxious, constantly overthinking, constantly waiting for the next moment things feel okay again. And still, you can't let go. That confusion makes many people feel weak. They start asking themselves, why do I miss someone who destroys my peace? Why do I keep going back after promising myself I'm done? Why does leaving feel physically painful? But trauma bonds are not built only emotionally, they are built neurologically too. Because when emotional pain becomes repeatedly followed by affection, relief, reassurance, attention, or temporary closeness, the brain starts associating relief with love. That changes everything. Suddenly, the affection feels more powerful because it arrives after suffering. The apology feels more emotional because it comes after distance. The attention feels intoxicating because your nervous system spent days emotionally starving for it. And slowly, your body becomes addicted to the cycle itself. Pain, anxiety, distance, relief, attachment, again and again. That is why trauma bonds feel stronger than healthy love. Healthy love creates stability. Trauma bonds create emotional highs and crashes. And emotionally intense relationships often feel unforgettable because your nervous system stops chasing connection and starts chasing emotional relief. That is why you check their messages constantly. Why silence creates panic. Why distance feels unbearable. Why one affectionate moment suddenly makes you forget weeks of emotional pain. Because trauma bonds condition people psychologically to survive on emotional crumbs while calling it love. And the dangerous part is that from the inside, it rarely feels toxic at first. It feels passionate, intense, deep, irreplaceable. But real love does not constantly destroy your nervous system. Real love does not make peace feel unfamiliar. Real love does not make you emotionally dependent on temporary relief from suffering. And today you are going to understand why trauma bonds feel so powerful psychologically, why your body keeps confusing emotional survival with love, and what truly begins happening the moment someone finally starts breaking free from the cycle. Because sometimes the strongest attachment is not created through healthy love, it is created through emotional conditioning. One of the biggest misunderstandings about trauma bonds is this: people think they are addicted to the person. But most of the time, they are addicted to relief. That changes the entire way you understand emotionally painful relationships. Because if you pay close attention, the moments that feel the most emotionally powerful are usually not the peaceful moments. They are the moments that happen after suffering, after distance, after anxiety, after emotional withdrawal, after feeling ignored, rejected, unloved, or emotionally abandoned. And then suddenly, they text you. They become affectionate again. They apologize, they finally give you attention, and your body instantly relaxes. That relief feels overwhelming emotionally because your nervous system spent so much time emotionally starving for connection. That is why even tiny moments of affection can feel incredibly intense inside trauma bonds. Not because the love itself is healthy, but because your body associates the relief from pain with emotional safety. That cycle slowly rewires your emotional reality. Pain, distance, anxiety, relief, attachment, again and again. And after enough repetition, your nervous system stops craving stable love. It starts craving emotional relief from suffering. That is why trauma bonds become chemically addictive psychologically. Because your body becomes emotionally dependent on the highs that arrive after emotional lows. And those highs feel powerful precisely because they are inconsistent. Healthy affection feels calm, predictable, safe. But intermittent affection creates obsession because the brain keeps chasing the next emotional reward. That is why people trapped inside trauma bonds often become hyper-focused on tiny changes in behavior. A text suddenly changes your mood. A compliment restores your emotional hope. One affectionate conversation suddenly makes you forget how emotionally exhausted you felt the day before. Because emotionally deprived nervous systems become hypersensitive to relief. And many people mistake that emotional intensity for deep love. But there is a huge psychological difference between "I feel emotionally safe with this person" and "I feel emotionally relieved." When this person temporarily stops hurting me, that difference changes everything. Because relief and love are not the same thing. And perhaps one of the saddest parts of trauma bonds is that the relationship itself often creates the emotional pain, then temporarily becomes the source of relief from the same pain it caused. That creates dependency, because now your nervous system associates the person with both suffering and emotional rescue at the same time. And slowly, you stop chasing healthy connection. You start chasing the next moment of relief. That is why emotionally painful relationships can feel impossible to leave, even when they are destroying your peace. Because your body is no longer attached only to the person. It is attached to the cycle itself. And the longer that cycle continues, the more your brain starts confusing emotional anxiety with love. One of the most dangerous things trauma bonds do is changing the way your nervous system experiences emotional connection. Because after enough emotional instability, anxiety starts feeling emotionally familiar. And what feels familiar often starts feeling like love. That is why many people leave emotionally healthy relationships feeling underwhelmed, yet remain deeply attached to relationships that constantly destroy their peace. Not because healthy love is weaker, but because chaos creates stronger emotional stimulation. Trauma bonds create emotional highs and crashes that flood the nervous system with adrenaline, dopamine, anticipation, fear, relief, obsession, and emotional uncertainty. And over time, your brain becomes chemically conditioned to that intensity. That is why emotionally stable love can initially feel strange after toxic relationships. There is no constant panic, no emotional chasing, no obsessive overthinking. No fear of abandonment every few hours. No unpredictable emotional swings. And because the nervous system became addicted to emotional intensity, calmness can temporarily feel boring. That realization shocks many people, because they spent years believing love was supposed to feel overwhelming, intense, uncontrollable, emotionally consuming. But emotional chaos is not proof of emotional depth. Sometimes it is proof of emotional conditioning. That is why trauma bonds create such powerful obsession. Your brain becomes trapped in cycles of uncertainty. You never fully know when affection will come back. You never fully feel emotionally safe. And uncertainty psychologically increases emotional fixation. Your mind starts focusing constantly on the relationship. You analyze messages repeatedly. You obsess over tone changes. You replay conversations. You wait emotionally for the next moment of reassurance. And because relief feels so powerful after anxiety, the relationship starts feeling emotionally special, even when it is emotionally damaging. That is what trauma bonds do psychologically. They train your body to associate emotional instability with emotional importance. And eventually, your nervous system stops recognizing peace as connection. It starts recognizing chaos as connection instead. That is why many people trapped in trauma bonds say things like, "I've never felt this way about anyone before." and they are telling the truth. Because trauma bonds create emotional intensity that healthy relationships usually do not create. But intensity is not the same thing as love. Fear is not connection. Obsessive attachment is not emotional safety. And the longer someone lives inside emotional instability, the more normal that instability begins feeling psychologically. That is the dangerous part, because eventually emotional chaos stops feeling toxic, it starts feeling familiar. And once emotional instability becomes familiar, the relationship turns into something even harder to escape. A psychological prison built on intermittent affection. One of the most powerful psychological mechanisms behind trauma bonds is intermittent affection, not constant love, not emotional stability, unpredictability. Because predictability creates safety, but unpredictability creates obsession. That is why trauma bonds feel so emotionally consuming. Your nervous system never fully knows when affection is coming back. One day, they feel distant, cold, emotionally unavailable. The next day, they suddenly become affectionate again, apologetic again, emotionally intense again. And those sudden moments of connection feel incredibly powerful because your body spent so much time emotionally deprived beforehand. That creates emotional dependency. You stop emotionally relaxing inside the relationship because your nervous system becomes permanently alert, constantly waiting for emotional change, waiting for the text, waiting for the apology, waiting for affection, waiting for reassurance, waiting for the next emotional high. And slowly, your emotional state starts depending entirely on their behavior. If they become affectionate, you feel relief. If they become distant, anxiety immediately returns. That emotional unpredictability traps the nervous system inside constant anticipation. And anticipation is psychologically addictive, because the brain becomes focused on chasing the reward instead of evaluating the damage. That is why many people trapped in trauma bonds say, but when things are good, they feel really good. And that is exactly the problem. The highs feel emotionally intense because they arrive after emotional suffering. That is why random affection feels more addictive than consistent affection psychologically. The uncertainty increases emotional fixation. Your brain starts chasing the next moment of emotional relief the same way gamblers chase unpredictable rewards. And eventually, something dangerous happens. You stop chasing the person themselves. You start chasing the emotional high they occasionally create. That changes the relationship completely, because now your nervous system is no longer asking, "Am I emotionally safe here?" It is asking, "When will I feel relief again?" That is survival mode. And the longer someone stays trapped inside intermittent affection, the harder it becomes to think clearly emotionally. Because emotional unpredictability slowly destroys emotional stability from within. You become hyper-aware of tiny changes in mood, tiny changes in tone, tiny changes in attention. Your emotional reality starts revolving around their emotional availability. And perhaps the saddest part is this: many people trapped inside trauma bonds genuinely believe the emotional intensity means the connection is rare or special. But emotional obsession is not proof of healthy love. Sometimes, it is proof that your nervous system has been conditioned around emotional uncertainty for too long. And the longer this continues, the harder it becomes to trust yourself, your instincts, and your own perception of reality. One of the most damaging effects of trauma bonds is not only the emotional pain, it is the way they slowly disconnect you from yourself, your instincts, your judgment, your emotional compass. Because when someone repeatedly hurts you, confuses you, reassures you, then hurts you again, your nervous system eventually stops trusting its own perception clearly. At first, you still recognize the red flags. You still feel something is wrong. You still notice the emotional exhaustion, the anxiety, the inconsistency. But after enough emotional conditioning, something begins changing psychologically. You start explaining away behaviors that once would have immediately disturbed you. You begin rationalizing pain, minimizing disrespect, questioning your own reactions instead of questioning the relationship itself. That is when trauma bonds become extremely dangerous emotionally. Because now you are no longer asking, is this relationship healthy for me? You are asking, how do I stop them from leaving? That shift changes everything, because survival becomes more important than self-protection. And slowly, your mind starts adapting around emotional instability. You over-explain yourself constantly. You rehearse conversations before having them. You analyze every text message. You become hyper-aware of their moods. You try to predict emotional reactions before they happen. And without realizing it, your nervous system becomes emotionally organized around avoiding abandonment instead of protecting peace. That creates deep self-doubt. Because the more emotionally unstable the relationship becomes, the less clearly you trust your own instincts. You start thinking, maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I'm expecting too much. Maybe I'm the problem. That psychological confusion disconnects people from reality, slowly, because trauma bonds force people to emotionally survive inside contradiction. The person hurting you also becomes the person temporarily comforting you. The person creating your anxiety also becomes the person relieving it. That emotional contradiction destroys internal certainty, and once self-trust weakens, emotional dependence grows stronger. Because now you no longer feel emotionally safe within yourself. You feel emotionally safe only when the relationship temporarily feels stable again. That is dependency, not healthy attachment. And the saddest part is that many people trapped in trauma bonds stop listening to their own pain completely. Their body feels exhausted. Their mind feels overwhelmed. Their emotions feel unstable. But they continue staying because emotional conditioning convinced them that survival inside the relationship matters more than emotional freedom outside it. That is why trauma bonds disconnect people from their internal emotional compass. Because little by little, they stop trusting what they feel and start trusting the cycle instead. And once emotional dependence reaches that level, leaving the relationship can begin feeling physically painful. One of the most confusing parts of trauma bonds is missing someone who destroyed your peace. That contradiction makes many people feel ashamed, because logically, they know the relationship hurt them. They know the anxiety was real. They know the emotional exhaustion was real. And still, part of them keeps missing the person intensely. That is what trauma bonds do psychologically. They make emotional pain feel emotionally attached to love. And the hardest part is that your mind rarely remembers the relationship accurately after separation. It remembers emotionally selective moments, the affection, the chemistry, the apologies, the late-night conversations, the moments that temporarily stop the suffering. That is why nostalgia becomes so dangerous after trauma bonds. Your brain starts replaying emotional relief while minimizing the emotional damage surrounding it. You remember how good it felt when they finally became loving again. But your nervous system temporarily forgets how much pain existed before that moment arrived. That creates emotional confusion. Because now your heart believes it misses the person, when often it actually misses relief from emotional withdrawal. There is a huge psychological difference between those two things. You are not missing peace. You are missing temporary relief from pain. That is why separation from trauma bonds can feel almost physical. Your body reacts with anxiety, panic, emotional emptiness, insomnia, obsessive thinking, emotional cravings, and intense longing because your nervous system became chemically attached to the cycle itself. Pain, relief, attachment, again and again. And once the cycle suddenly stops, your nervous system reacts like something essential disappeared. That is why many people go back even after clearly recognizing the relationship was unhealthy. Not because the relationship truly healed, but because the withdrawal became emotionally unbearable. And perhaps one of the saddest parts of trauma bonds is this: people often mistake emotional withdrawal for proof of love. They think, if I miss them this much, it must be real. But emotional dependency can create longing just as intense as genuine connection, sometimes even stronger. Because unstable affection creates obsessive attachment. That is why trauma bonds often feel impossible to break emotionally. Your body became attached to the moments that stopped the suffering, not the suffering itself. And until someone understands that difference clearly, they often continue romanticizing the relationship instead of recognizing the emotional conditioning behind it. But there is one thing trauma bonds fear the most: clarity. Because the moment someone truly stops romanticizing the pain, the entire emotional cycle begins weakening. Healing from a trauma bond usually begins with one painful realization: the relationship was not emotionally intense because it was healthy. It was emotionally intense because your nervous system was trapped inside instability. That realization changes everything. Because for a long time, many people romanticize the suffering. They convince themselves the emotional highs and crashes mean the connection is rare, deep, irreplaceable, or somehow more real than ordinary love. But eventually, reality starts becoming stronger than fantasy. You begin seeing the patterns more clearly: the inconsistency, the emotional manipulation, the repeated cycles, the way peace only existed temporarily before anxiety returned again. And slowly, your mind starts asking different questions. Not, how do I get them back? But, why did I believe emotional suffering was love? That question becomes a turning point psychologically. Because trauma bonds survive through emotional illusion. They survive through hope, fantasy, emotional dependency, and intermittent relief. But once someone stops romanticizing the pain, the illusion weakens. You stop focusing only on the beautiful moments. You start seeing the emotional cost attached to them. You stop glorifying the chemistry. You start recognizing the exhaustion underneath it. You stop calling emotional chaos passion. You start recognizing it as nervous system instability. That clarity is emotionally painful at first because it forces people to confront something difficult. The relationship was not giving them peace. It was giving them temporary relief from the pain the relationship itself created. That realization hurts deeply because it breaks the fantasy many people emotionally survived on for a long time. But it also creates freedom. Because healing begins the moment reality becomes more emotionally important than emotional craving. That is why one of the strongest signs someone is truly breaking a trauma bond is this: they stop making excuses for behaviors that continuously hurt them. They stop confusing inconsistency with complexity. They stop believing love must constantly involve suffering. And perhaps one of the most important realizations during healing is understanding this: love should not constantly require emotional recovery. Healthy love should not leave your nervous system exhausted. Awareness is often the first step toward breaking the cycle. Because once someone finally understands the difference between trauma bonding and healthy love, their entire emotional reality begins changing. And little by little, the relationship that once felt impossible to leave loses its emotional control. Not because the memories disappear overnight, but because the nervous system finally learns something it forgot a long time ago. Peace is not boring. Peace is safe.